Hello and welcome to the Hormones in Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Vivian Allred, naturopathic nutritional therapist and hormone enthusiast. If you want to learn how to rebalance your female hormones, regulate your menstrual cycle and reclaim your vitality, then you are in the right place. Each week I will be delving into different conditions such as PCOS, endometriosis, infertility, hypothyroidism, acne and hair loss. Stay tuned for interviews with expert guests, Q&As and solo episodes that are all intended to help you move from hormonal chaos to hormonal harmony. If you'd like to submit a question for me to answer on the podcast, then you can email them to hormonesinharmony@gmail.com. The information shared on this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not designed to replace the advice of your health practitioner. That said, let's get into today's episode. Hi, welcome back to episode number 15. Today I'm joined by Nicola Rinaldi and we're talking all about hypothalamic amenorrhea. Dr. Nicola Rinaldi has a PhD in biology from MIT. Since experiencing hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is missing periods, she has been on a mission to spread awareness of this condition and how to recover. In 2016, she published the book No Period, Now What, which was updated in March 2019 to be more health at every size aligned. This book is a comprehensive resource that includes much of the medical and scientific research that underlies our current understanding of the triggers for amenorrhea, what steps to take for recovery, and treatments to use for recovery and pregnancy as needed. Since publishing No Period Now What, Dr. Rinaldi has been on a mission to spread awareness about hypothalamic amenorrhea and recovery, appearing as a guest on dozens of podcasts like this one, attending and presenting at industry conferences, as well as continuing to participate in ongoing academic research studies. She now works with clients on period recovery and getting pregnant. In this episode, we're going to cover Nicola's struggle with HA, what it actually is, and the three main factors that can contribute to the development of it. The importance of our menstrual cycle and ovulation for overall health, weight management and how that plays into hypothalamic amenorrhea. We also discuss intuitive eating, why the birth control pill isn't the answer to a missing period, and how to overcome HA naturally using nutrition and lifestyle changes. I want to preface this episode by just giving you a heads up. Me and Nicola do kind of disagree on certain points. There's a lot we have in common, but just certain things in terms of the approach she takes in terms of diet. For her, she believes that people should just eat whatever they want as long as they're getting the calories. If they want to eat cakes, then go ahead. And I do definitely agree with that in some cases. If we're healthy, we can handle things like that. I refer to them as junk foods, which she wasn't really on board with, but I feel like a lot of people who are struggling with HA, in my experience, are also dealing with many other health conditions, whether that's autoimmunity, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, insulin resistance, and I don't believe that it's necessary that we always have to turn to some of these junk foods, ice creams, pizza, to get enough calories or to get our period back. I've personally did it the healthy way, and many of my clients have also done the same. It's totally easy to get 2,500, 3,000 calories every single day using healthy foods, whether that's meat, eggs, healthy fats, oils, fruits and starches. And if I was to eat cakes and pizza, then I would feel absolutely terrible, and I don't think that's a good way to support our hormone balance. I understand that they're easier to get calories, but I don't think it's the only way. Plus, the concept of intuitive eating does work really well for many women, and I do recommend it for those who are balanced and are healthy. But if people are struggling with chronic yeast infections, sugar addictions, appetite or metabolic dysfunction, then I don't think that they can follow intuitive eating like Nicola recommends. And it's all good having junk food on occasion if you really want to and not restricting, but when you're on a healing journey and dealing with chronic illness, chronic inflammation, then I don't believe that that's always the right move. So yeah, I just wanted to share that because that's kind of things that we get into during the podcast episode, and I totally respect Nicola's work and she provided a lot of really good information on the podcast, but I did want to make that difference in the way that we approach certain things. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love for you to kind of start by introducing yourself and explaining how you got into female hormones and in particular hypothalamic amenorrhea.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate the chance to connect with you and your audience. So my journey to HA to learning about HA started because I actually experienced it myself. So at the end of my graduate school career, I was doing a PhD at MIT in computational biology. I was exercising a lot. I was doing a bunch of things because I loved them. I was completely non-athletic in high school, and then over the years since high school, like college, and then between college and grad school, and then grad school, I just started playing a bunch of sports and weightlifting and just doing all these things that I found that I really, really loved them. My major sport was ice hockey, which I picked up after I met my husband. I had figure skated as a kid, and then he was going off and playing once a week. And I was like, that looks like fun. Can I come? And he said, sure, and put me in his gear from when he was a teenager. And I was absolutely hooked. I loved it so much. So that was all well and good. And then some of the guys in my lab decided to go on a diet. And I was like, oh, yeah, I could lose some weight. And I'd been reading a lot about, I was thinking about getting pregnant. And I've been reading a lot about, so many places seem to be saying lose weight to have an easy time getting pregnant and lose weight to have a healthy pregnancy. And so I was like, oh, perfect. I want to get pregnant. So this is like great timing. So I cut my calories significantly, ended up losing a fair bit of weight, about 10% of my body weight. And then about a month, 6 weeks later, I went off the birth control pill to, think like I was ready to get pregnant. And so my period never showed up. In hindsight, it's no surprise whatsoever. I mean, I just put my body through this incredibly stressful experience of losing all that weight and underfueling. But at the time, I was like, that's really weird. I don't understand what's going on. So I saw a bunch of doctors, and eventually, about 6 months later, I was diagnosed with hypothalamic amenorrhea, which we often abbreviate as HA just because hypothalamic amenorrhea is kind of a mouthful. Yeah. So that's sort of what happened to me. And then I looked around on the internet. This was in 2004. And there was really nothing out there about HA. There was no other stories, no blogs, nothing. So I started my own blog, and I sort of got involved in just the general infertility blogging community. And I was just trying to learn more about HA and understand it. And so I researched the medical literature because I'm a scientist, so that's what I do. And eventually I kind of figured out that I needed to cut down on my exercise and eat more. I went through a whole journey with fertility treatments because I had started seeing a reproductive endocrinologist, and even though I had one period, she then said, "Oh, you never know when you're going to get another one because you had irregular cycles as a kid." And so I jumped into doing injectables. She also told me that the oral medications wouldn't work for getting pregnant, which is also probably not true. Something else I've discovered in my years since then. So I did eventually end up getting pregnant naturally. I had 4 failed injectable cycles, and then we were going to do IVF, but waiting for insurance reasons. And I ovulated on my own, and I was amazingly lucky in that I got pregnant on that first ovulation. So then I was on bed rest for a little while I was pregnant and found the Fertile Thoughts message board, which is kind of, nobody's really posting on it anymore because Facebook is a lot more, what's the word I'm looking for, interactive. Yeah. But so I posted on that board for a long time and learned a ton just from, chatting with the other women who were on there who also had HA and sharing my experiences. And every time somebody had a question, I'd go look in the medical literature to answer it. And so I learned a ton. And eventually the women on the board would say to me, "You know so much, you should write a book." And I was like, yeah, I should, because it's not something I'd ever thought about, but I had something to say. And so it took me 3.5 years, which is way, way, way longer than I ever expected. But I think that the book is really comprehensive and shares just about everything that I know about HA. And I've definitely gotten really good reviews, and I think it's helped a lot of people since I published it. So that's my story.
And the book definitely helped me, as did the Facebook group. You've got a massive community on Facebook, and yeah, really interactive, so much knowledge and support on there too. And I struggled with HA myself along with PCOS, so we're going to discuss that a bit more too. The two can definitely coincide, and maybe you're more likely to develop HA when you've got a hormone imbalance like PCOS. And that's what happened to me. I came off the pill, didn't have a period for like 2 years, partly due to chronic gut issues, stress, restrictive diets because of the gut issues, over exercising. Pretty much all of the different risk factors were kind of rolled into one, and yeah, I didn't have a period for 2 years. The treatment approach for hypothalamic amenorrhea is a little bit different to what people would usually consider with hormone imbalances. Like you say, it's usually restrict, cut things down, restrict calories, restrict fat. But we'll definitely go deep into the dietary approaches and the lifestyle approaches too. If someone's listening to this, they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. What is HA? Could you just give them a basic overview of what it is?
Yes.
Maybe the common indicators and the common risk factors too.
Yes, absolutely. So hypothalamic amenorrhea is when you are missing your monthly menstrual cycle because your hypothalamus is not doing its job in sort of starting the menstrual cycle. So the hypothalamus is an organ in your brain that collects information from a whole bunch of different bodily systems, and then also sends out signals to a number of different systems to basically run our bodies. So our hypothalamus controls how warm we are. It controls our hunger and fullness signals. It controls our stress system, and it also controls our reproductive system. So all of those things are intertwined, and all of them kind of feed back on each other. The thyroid is also involved, as well as the pituitary. None of our systems are totally independent. So what happens with hypothalamic amenorrhea is that your hypothalamus gets suppressed for one of a number of reasons. So there are 3 major factors that can suppress your hypothalamus. I think the biggest one by far is energy deficit. So if you are not eating enough on a daily basis to support everything that your body needs and wants to do, then that can, your body doesn't have enough energy to do, to run your reproductive system, to keep you warm, to keep your hair and nails growing, to, keep your immune system going. So it has to figure out something to shut down to save energy, because it only has a finite amount. It only has as much as you're eating on a daily basis, minus anything you're spending on exercise. So one of the first things to go is often shutting down the reproductive system, because that's optional. We don't have to have babies. So that's a very easy way for our bodies to save on energy. So energy deficit is definitely the biggest factor in HA. The 2 other factors are stress hormone, both stress hormone related, but in different ways. So high intensity exercise causes increases in cortisol and other stress hormones. And those hormones, the cortisol, the beta endorphins, I think it's ACTH, can all also impact the hypothalamus and help suppress it. And then any psychological stress, it can be an acute event like the death of a loved one or a divorce, something like that. Huge amounts of cortisol can be produced, and those can shut down the hypothalamus. And then also just sort of ongoing daily stress, job stress, stress in a relationship. We don't often think of it this way, but the stress of counting calories and macros and watching what we eat very carefully, that can actually be stressful. And, just overall type A perfectionist tendencies, those can all sort of play a part in the chronic stress that we're exposed to. So any one of those factors alone can shut down the hypothalamus, but they seem to synergize, and together, like if you have 2 or 3 of those factors, then it's even more likely that your hypothalamus is going to be shut down because it's getting suppressive signals from a bunch of different avenues. There's a really interesting study that was done in monkeys, and they exposed the monkeys to either diet plus exercise or stress, which was in the form of moving from one cage to another, which is stressful for the animals. Or they exposed them to both, so diet plus exercise plus stress. They found that in the monkeys that were either doing the diet plus exercise condition or the stress condition, 1 or 2 out of 10 lost their menstrual cycles. In those that were exposed to both, I think it was 8 out of 10 that lost their menstrual cycle. So that just kind of shows you how all the factors can really work together to suppress your system. Obviously, genetics plays a part. We're all different. We all have different, maybe little small changes in our hormones, in our hormone receptors. So that also is a factor. And then the final thing is kind of related to the energy deficit, but it's weight loss. So if you've lost a fair bit of weight in the past, which I did a big survey for my book to kind of provide some data around different factors in HA and recovery. And I sort of defined a loss of 10 pounds, which is slightly under 5 kilograms or more, as significant. And I was actually really surprised when I analyzed the results of the survey to find that 82% of the women in that cohort that had HA had a weight loss of at least 10 pounds in their past. And so I think that for many of us, we follow the societal ideals of wanting, a smaller body being better. And so we might lose weight from a place where our body is happy and comfortable and we can eat whatever we want. We control our food, we exercise a lot, we lose weight, we think we're doing the right thing, we think we're healthy and, healthier. But in fact, that weight loss can either cause HA immediately, as it did with me, or it can predispose you to HA in the future, so that, if you've had that weight loss in the past and then you increase the intensity of your exercise, boom, your period can go missing very easily.
I think it's a common misconception that you need to be really underweight. So you need to be either have an eating disorder, be skin and bones before your period's going to be effective. But could you be technically overweight still, or of a normal weight and still experience hypothalamic amenorrhea?
Yes, HA can happen to somebody no matter what their absolute body size. It's much more about the factors that I've just described. So weight loss, the chronic underfueling, all of those can affect somebody no matter what their absolute body size. It does tend to be more common in women in smaller bodies, just because they tend to be underfueling more. But certainly I've seen HA across a wide range of body sizes.
Okay. And for those thinking, I've lost my period, or I would love to lose my period because I don't want to get pregnant, what's your advice on that? Why is our menstrual cycle so important for our health?
It's extremely important for our health, absolutely not just for getting pregnant. Getting pregnant is a very small part of it, actually. The monthly changes in not only estrogen and progesterone, which are the hormones that most people know about, but there are about 20 different hormones that are involved in our menstrual cycle. So all of those are cycling in different ways throughout the month. So we know that estrogen and progesterone are heavily involved in things like bone density. So there's very strong evidence that if you are not cycling regularly, that means your estrogen and progesterone are at baseline levels all the time. They're not getting that large increase that you would normally see, as you approach ovulation for the estrogen and after ovulation for the progesterone. So those are not only so bone density is a really big one. The evidence is mounting that estrogen plays a good part in helping our hearts stay healthy, and there's some of it comes from women who have undergone surgical menopause. So before they would naturally, you find that heart disease increases markedly after that, and also in women who do go through normal menopause. So that's another place where estrogen and probably progesterone is helpful for our general health. Is our heart. There are also suggestions that without the estrogen, that the estrogen is helpful for our brain development and supporting our brains. Women who undergo the surgical menopause are more likely to have earlier neurodegenerative diseases. So estrogen is a remarkable hormone, and we always talk a lot about estrogen. Maybe we throw in progesterone, but like I said, there are about 20 different hormones that are involved in our menstrual cycles. So I'm sure that some of those are playing roles in, sort of normal, healthy hormones and behaviors that we don't even necessarily know about yet.
Absolutely. And apart from the lack of period, are there any other indicators or signs and symptoms someone could be experiencing when they're not having the period regularly?
Well, so there's the period, which is the bleed, and then there's ovulation. So I actually think it's really important for women to know what ovulation is. It's basically that's the ovulation is what drives everything else. It's not the period. The period is as a result of having ovulated, and then your progesterone increases, your lining thickens so that your body is ready to support a baby. And if you don't get pregnant, then the lining sheds, and that's what causes your period. But it's all driven by the ovulation. I do think it's important for women to know what happens as you get closer to ovulation and how your body manifests ovulation, so that you can understand your cycle and know if you are ovulating or having an anovulatory cycle. Some other symptoms that you can experience if you don't have your periods are things like being cold all the time, brittle hair and nails. You might get sick a lot. Obviously, stress fractures are quite common particularly in runners who are not getting their periods. Also in other athletes in sort of sports where leanness is really emphasized, like ballet, maybe figure skating. So those are some other issues. There's often a lack of libido, no vaginal lubrication. Those things can also be annoying. Like I said, estrogen supports so many different systems in our body. If there's a sort of new term that's been defined in the last few years for all of this, for the cluster of symptoms and effects of low energy density, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. And if anyone's interested, I think if you Google that, there are some really great lists of the different systems that can be affected. Our GI system can be affected. There's lots of information out there about, that people can look into more if they're interested in sort of a much more comprehensive list of things that can be affected.
And is relative energy deficiency syndrome the same as the female athlete triad?
It's similar. The female athlete triad focuses obviously on women, and then the three major components of the female athlete triad are energy deficiency through underfueling, which can that sort of manifests on the spectrum from disordered eating to eating disorders. Bone density issues. So again, there's a spectrum there. Some people can have, totally normal bone density all the way down to osteoporosis. And then amenorrhea, and that's also on a spectrum from full amenorrhea to anovulation or luteal phase defects. So the female athlete triad comprises those three things. Relative energy deficiency in sport is kind of an idea of trying to broaden that to incorporate both men who do experience some symptoms of energy deficiency, probably not to the same level that women do, but certainly men can manifest low testosterone if they are doing some of the same behaviors, so underfueling, exercising a lot. And then also incorporating some of the other symptoms that are not discussed with to go along with the female athlete triad. So things like the GI effects, immune effects, just some of those other things that we've just been discussing.
And how would you differentiate HA from other conditions like loss of period due to PCOS or hypothyroidism, or issues with celiac disease, because that can sometimes lead to the period ceasing too? So how is it diagnosed and how is it different from those other conditions?
So I think a good place to start is with blood work. That can often help differentiate between a lot of those different possibilities. Another one that you didn't mention is high prolactin can also manifest by suppression of the reproductive hormones. So I would suggest that if somebody has amenorrhea, they get things like follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, luteinizing hormone, which is LH, estradiol, free testosterone, prolactin, 17-hydroxyprogesterone, and then some of the other androgens, DHEAS and androstenedione. Those hormones together can kind of give you a good sense of which of the prolactin as well, and thyroid hormones. Okay, there's
there's a list.
So I mean, you can, I would probably start with the thyroid hormones, making sure that those are normal, because having a thyroid that's not optimal can absolutely affect other things. So I can't remember if it's a hypo or a hyperthyroid, can affect prolactin and increase that, and then the prolactin suppresses the reproductive hormones. If you have a hyperlactin but your thyroid is normal, then it could be something called a pituitary microadenoma, which is a small growth on your pituitary gland that then causes your pituitary to make prolactin, which again suppresses your FSH and LH. Once those two things have been ruled out, looking at PCOS versus HA, with PCOS, you will probably have normal FSH, LH, the LH might be high. And then also you should have high testosterone, DHEAS, androstenedione. HA is the opposite in some ways. So with HA, your FSH will probably be normal, LH probably low, estradiol will be low, testosterone low. All of your other hormones are typically on the lower end of normal. So sometimes doctors will say, "Oh, your hormones are normal, you're fine." But if you actually look at where they fall and compared to the normal range, they're usually either below the normal range or just on the very low end. So it's definitely worth it if you get your hormones tested to ask for the actual numbers and the normal lab ranges, just to kind of see where you fall and not just accept that, everything's normal. That said, it is possible to have HA with completely typical normal FSH and LH. That happens in about 20% of women. And so you also have to take lifestyle factors into account. So some of the things that we've already talked about, like, are you quote unquote watching what you eat? Have you gone on a paleo diet recently, a keto diet? Are you avoiding gluten, dairy? Just how restrictive is your overall eating or your overall eating habits? Do you eat, treats when you go out with friends or when they're available at the office? Or are you the person that always says, no, I don't like that, I don't want that, so just kind of looking at your eating habits in that perspective. How much are you exercising? It can be, for many women with HA, they're exercising on a daily basis, 1 to 2 hours a day. You don't have to be a top athlete. You also don't have to do any exercise at all. So I have a graph from my survey where I looked at number of times per week that women with HA were exercising, as well as hours per day. There were 9 women out of 303 that were not exercising at all. So that happens. The median was exercising, I think it's 6 days a week for an hour a day. But I have an HA information sheet that's available on my website. If anyone wants to check that out, it's just noperiod.info/HA, and that'll take you to the page, and you can read a lot more and download my information sheet and also the first chapter of my book, so you can kind of see, how that, how much that rings true to you. So I think it can also be hard sometimes because with when women are told they have PCOS, they're often told eat less, cut out various foods, exercise more. So that can, the whole HA PCOS thing can be a little bit complicated. Another test that I think is very useful to get is an ultrasound of your ovaries and uterus. With PCOS, the latest criteria are to have more than 26 follicles on one ovary or an ovarian volume of greater than 10 cubic centimeters. With HA, you often have a lot of follicles, but your ovarian volume tends to be less than 10 cubic centimeters or 10 mils. And it's a little bit, often doctors will look at the ovaries of a woman with HA and be like, oh, there's lots of follicles, you must have PCOS. But it's important to actually follow those criteria, because women with HA do typically have what are better termed multicystic ovaries rather than polycystic. So polycystic, the latest research shows, do require more than 26 follicles per ovary. So I think that's another thing that can be helpful to distinguish between the two conditions.
Is there a reason that you know of why HA only presents in less cysts than PCOS, if they're both just due to anovulation?
I don't think they are both just due to anovulation. I think that the hormonal picture is different with PCOS, and so that's why it can lead to more follicles. I don't know exactly what the mechanism is there, but I do think that often that having the high androgens in PCOS is probably playing a part in the number of antral follicles that you see versus HA, where all your hormones are low.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know you talked about the restrictive diets and exercising, not too much, having treats every now and again, maybe some sugar and some gluten and dairy. But how does someone manage trying to be healthy and live a healthy lifestyle and really try to nourish the body with, quote, clean foods, organic foods, without risking losing their period?
Well, so I think part of the problem is that we live in a very a world of black and white. So I think there's a lot of misinformation about what's actually healthy in terms of nutrition. So there are a lot of cases, I think, where a study is done in some population, probably maybe a population that's susceptible to diabetes, and it's found that X amount of sugar leads to a larger proportion of people getting diabetes. And so all of a sudden there's all this news media, sugar is bad for you, sugar is toxic, sugar, So I think that there's a lot of taking information from scientific studies and extending it way further than it's legitimate to do so. The idea that sugar is bad and sugar is associated with diabetes. There's kind of a, if that's the case, there are so many other factors at play. It's certainly not the case that if you eat one molecule of sugar, all of a sudden you're going to have diabetes. So I think that really there needs to be more of a recognition that all of these things exist on a spectrum, and that we're each individuals and can tolerate different amounts of things. So the diet that's good for one person is not necessarily good for the person right next to them, because you have, different genetics, different life circumstances, different responses to stress. I mean, there's just so much about us that is unique, that to take, so the whole clean eating thing, I think, just takes dietary restriction too far. And it often causes women, or anyone really, to underfuel, because it can be really hard to eat what's actually a sufficient amount of calories for our bodies when you're focusing only on plant-based foods, or not ever eating any processed foods, not ever eating any like super fatty foods. And so it's just about maybe a little bit more balance in not only in our way of eating, but also in our way of thinking about food. And rather than thinking about it, thinking about different foods as the enemy, just thinking about food as something we eat to sustain our bodies. I think the idea that there are certain foods that you just cannot ever eat it just doesn't really follow biological principles. Our bodies have enzymes to be able to digest these foods. I think, if you eat only sugar all day long, every day, then of course you're going to be unhealthy. But by the same token, if you eat only broccoli all day long, every day, you're also probably going to be unhealthy, because you're missing out on a whole bunch of other nutrients that come from a wide variety of foods. So I think really the idea is, just eat what you feel like eating. If you're eating, like, yeah, I mean, it's just balance and, some moderation, and not always moderation. I mean, sometimes if you want, if especially if you've been restricting for a long time, you might get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to let myself eat all the foods, and then you go and eat a whole bag of chips, or, a whole, thing of cookies. And that's okay, because your body will kind of adjust over time, and you won't necessarily want all those things all the time forever. But the more we restrict, the more tempted we are by those forbidden, quote unquote, forbidden foods. So anyway, that's a long diatribe. I'm sorry.
No, I agree with that. It's very true. And I'm all for the body positivity movement, where we should all feel comfortable in our skin. But for those who do want to lose weight, I'm totally fine with that. If they're uncomfortable in their skin, if they are slightly overweight or severely overweight and they want to lose weight, then I totally support that. But how does someone lose weight without also losing the period? Are there things that they can do, or is it just like a protective mechanism from your body?
So you raised some interesting questions there. So the whole idea of, overweight, that's actually a really interesting one to explore. So what I've discovered, I really encourage people to read Linda Bacon's Health at Every Size and Body Respect. She has found, or she expressed, that the definition of overweight and obese was actually not based on any real science. It was simply plucked out of the air as, oh, let's choose these numbers and call this overweight, quote unquote overweight, or quote unquote obese. I actually looked into the information for how the underweight BMI category was defined, and I found the same thing. I read through the World Health Organization report, and there was not strong evidence for coming up with 18.5 as being quote unquote underweight. There's certainly studies that show that women with BMI, or people with BMIs below that, can be less healthy. But there was really no strong reason for choosing 18.5. So I think that sometimes that categorization can be unhelpful, because our bodies are genetically made to be a whole range of different sizes. And putting labels on a size just because of this random categorization, I think is like, it just makes people feel less worthy, and because of the size of their body. So I've really tried to move away from that. And in fact, I just updated my book earlier this year to remove some of that terminology, just because I think that it's just not helpful in any way. And I think the focus should be more on, rather than on somebody's body size, focusing on their health parameters, their cholesterol levels, blood work, in the case of HA, focusing on the reproductive hormones, and sort of tailoring health recommendations towards those parameters, rather than just looking at size. And a lot of when people feel, quote unquote, uncomfortable in their bodies, I think it's really good to sort of investigate why that is, and how much of it is coming from actually feeling physically uncomfortable, versus that being not the societal norm and not looking like what we see in the magazines and on TV and all of that. So I think that that's just an area that's worth somebody exploring. So intuitive eating is, I think, a really good model for people to follow. There's the book Intuitive Eating itself by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Rush that I really encourage people to read. It sort of talks about how, there are 10 principles of intuitive eating. I'm not an intuitive eating practitioner. I haven't been trained in that, so I think I'll leave that for maybe you could have one of them on your podcast. But really, the idea is that listening to your body, following your hunger cues, following your fullness cues, eating what you want to eat, and not focusing on that, and focusing on being kind to your body, rather than specifically focusing on your weight and your body size. Some people find that they lose weight with intuitive eating. Some people find that they don't. But when that's not your focus anymore, I think you end up being happier and healthier overall for the long term.
Yeah, when I mentioned the like overweight, those kind of terms, what I meant was it's when your weight actually starts affecting your health negatively. So both ways, like when you get too lean for your particular body weight, it's different for everyone, and there's a massive range of numbers. It's not the numbers that are the concern, it's when you get too kind of overweight for your hormones, your mental health, inflammation levels, your joints, then how can someone lose weight when it is actually negatively affecting their health? Would intuitive eating be the go-to for you?
So, yeah, I mean, I think the focus should not be on the weight, because it's often not the weight itself that's the issue. It's probably more about eating and exercise habits. And so focusing on making changes in that way, rather than, oh, I need to lose X amount or, X kilos or pounds or whatever. I think focusing on, making sure that focusing on eating a variety of foods, incorporating more fruits and vegetables if you're not eating a lot of fruits and vegetables at the moment, not eating out all the time, sort of looking at it from that perspective. If you're somebody who's been totally sedentary for a long time, thinking about ways that you could incorporate more movement into your day, a little bit of walking. Maybe you find that there's just so many different ways that we can move our bodies. For me, I really enjoy weightlifting. I like feeling strong. I play ice hockey. I used to play volleyball. I love playing squash. So finding a form of like dancing is a great one for people to kind of pick up, because there's just so much joy in dancing and moving your body in that way. So I think that if you focus on some of those habits and behaviors and lifestyle changes, rather than thinking about the body size, because it's really much more about incorporating some of those, and that's what really induces health, rather than the absolute, change in body size, which if you do that in an unhealthy way, which can be like, the shakes or, severely restricting your calories, any of that stuff, I think is really hard to maintain for the long term. And so it honestly probably is more likely to make things worse than better. Maybe you have a short-term weight loss, but it's much harder to maintain that if you're focusing on diet and, changing the body size, rather than just changing your mindset around how you're eating and how you're exercising. So again, the book Intuitive Eating is great. Body Kindness by Rebecca Scritchfield is another one that I would strongly recommend to people to learn, help you learn to appreciate your body for what it is and what it does for you, as opposed to thinking so much about, oh my gosh, I need to lose X amount or, anything like that. So
yeah, and I'll include the links to those books in the show notes for those who are interested as well. And I always say the same, I'm not focusing on weight or the numbers on the scale. If people are concerned about that, when I explain that once the body's healthy and we're focused on health rather than the numbers, then the weight does actually regulate and kind of get to where it wants to be and get into that sweet spot where it feels happy and safe. But for people who maybe struggling with the intuitive eating, say they have maybe a candida overgrowth that's causing them to crave sugar uncontrollably, or they have issues with appetite regulation, leptin, ghrelin, those types of problems. Does intuitive eating still work with them, or what are some other kind of ways that they can support their health?
So this is getting a little bit out of my area of knowledge. So I would probably suggest that kind of question be addressed to somebody who's more specialized and trained in the intuitive eating.
Okay, no problem. And onto the treatment of HA. So the conventional treatment approach is usually, from my experience, the birth control pill. It's going to get your period back. It's going to regulate your cycle and make all of your PMS symptoms go away at the same time, which sounds great, but what's the problem with that? Why is the birth control pill not the answer when it comes to a missing period?
So I think the biggest reason that it's not the answer is that birth control pills typically contain only one or two synthetic hormones. So that's, probably some form of estradiol, it's at a low level, and then some progesterone. So as you recall, we talked about there are about 20 different hormones that are involved in our normal menstrual cycle. So to argue that replacing two of them is going to do the same thing, I think is, not really accurate. There was a nice study that came out recently where the researchers looked at a hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, and they found that that is actually suppressed by birth control pills, and it's highly involved in increasing bone density. So, there's like a lot of doctors will say, oh, take the pill, it will protect your bones. But there have been quite a few studies where there's been evidence that that's not the case. One that I like to point to was done in teenagers. So this is comparing teenagers on the birth control pill versus those not on the birth control pill and regularly menstruating. The girls on the pill gained bone density at a rate of about 2% per year, and those not on the pill were gained at 12%. So that's a pretty big difference. And there are other studies that have found similar results. So if you have HA and you are not willing yet to work toward recovery, then being on the pill is okay. It's better than not being on anything. Doing hormone replacement therapy is probably better. That's something else they found in the study I was just telling you about, the IGF-1, was that hormone replacement therapy where you're using bioidentical estrogen and progesterone, there was not the same decrease in the IGF-1. So that's probably better than being on birth control pills, although it does not, the hormone replacement therapy does not provide the same birth control protections the birth control pills do. So that's something to just to be aware of. But it probably is better for you health-wise. But by far the best option is working to regain your own natural menstrual cycles. So that's through a combination of eating more. I generally recommend about 2,500 calories per day, which can sound like a huge number if you've been restricting and you sort of have been taught through the media that you quote unquote should be eating 1,500 or 1,800, and many women are eating less than that even. Some of the fitness tracker apps, MyFitnessPal, for example, I think strongly encourages underfueling. I don't think that the amounts that they're telling people to eat are actually sufficient to fuel your body. So I really despise those apps. Not only because of the under fueling, like the caloric recommendations that tend to be under what we actually need, but also because, like we talked about earlier, tracking can actually be kind of stressful. And these days we're tracking everything. We're tracking our calories, we're tracking our steps, we're tracking our heart rate. So all of that kind of forces us to be thinking about food and fitness all the time. And I really think that they should be so much more secondary in our lives and let us focus on other things that are more important, like our relationships and, what we can do to make the world better. Let's see, where was I? I keep going off on these tangents. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Where does the kind of 2,500 calories come in? How was that determined?
Okay, so the sort of common recommendation has been 2,000 calories per day for a woman of sort of typical stature, and that is based on self-reported caloric intake. So they did a bunch of surveys. People said how much they were eating in a day. The average is about 2,000. So that's kind of become the recommendation because when our weight is stable, we're probably taking in about as much as we're expending. So if you're taking in 2,000 a day and your weight is stable, you're probably expending 2,000 a day. That's sort of where that comes from. The problem is that many people tend to underreport when they are asked on surveys how much they're eating. They might forget a snack. They might not necessarily count things accurately. They might estimate that they're eating less volume-wise than they actually are. So more recently, researchers have used a couple of different methods to find, to really get a more accurate idea of how many calories we're taking in and burning on a daily basis. And so that's actually where the 2,500 comes from. So there are two different methods. One is through using what's called doubly labeled water. So it's water that has two different radioactive isotopes in it, one on a carbon, one on a hydrogen, I think, or maybe it's oxygen and hydrogen. But anyway, the researchers are able to measure how much of the two different molecules comes out in your breath and I think water. It's been a little while since I've read the paper, so I'm a little sketchy on the details. But basically, they came up with a series of equations, and I used those equations to kind of figure out that for a woman who's about 5'6", which is about 165 centimeters, 2,500 calories a day is sort of what you should be eating to maintain a healthy, fertile, body size. If you're shorter, you can, it's a little bit less. If you're taller, it's a little bit more, because obviously, like your height has an impact on how much lean body mass you have, which is really the driver behind that. Another group used a different method where basically they have people in a room that measures all the intake and output, and they also came up with an equation where it's about 45 kilocalories per kilogram of lean body mass. And if you multiply all that out, it ends up being the same, about 2,500 calories a day for a woman who is active, which I define as sort of, I think most women with HA tend to be on the more active side. Even if we have a quote unquote sedentary job, we're getting up, we're walking around, we're, taking walking breaks. So I think that for somebody who's active, that, that's a reasonable daily caloric target.
Is that for the average woman then, or someone struggling with HA? Do they increase to 2,500 to get the period back? Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the 2,500 is about what we should all be eating. But so for somebody who does not have their period, they've typically been eating quite a bit less than that. So you increase to 2,500. There will probably be some weight gain, but it's it all goes to getting your body to the size that it naturally wants to be at, as well as giving your body fuel for all of the things that have been shut down over the time that you've been under fueling, and sort of repairs, particularly if you've been severely underweight, but even if you've just been a little bit under the size that your body really wants to be, or if you've just been restricting for a long time, giving your body some fuel to repair things that it has not had energy to repair in the past. That all is what happens when you actually fuel your body appropriately.
There's quite a bit of terminology when I was in the Facebook group about going all in with your diet. Can you just explain what that is? And also there's kind of a controversy whether you should stick with just healthy foods. Obviously that's different for everyone, but should you focus on healthy foods or should you just eat whatever you want, junk food included?
So I kind of hate the term junk food. In the book, I use the term fertility foods instead.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of things around that type of food. Hyper palatable foods is another way that we could describe them. So the thing is that it can be really challenging to get in enough calories if you are focusing only on the quote unquote healthy foods. So like if you think about it, a cup of spinach has like 7 calories in it. So you have to eat a boatload of stuff if you're focusing only on, sort of raw vegetables and, that kind of thing. So it can, like, a piece of pizza has like 450, something like that calories. So, do you want to eat 10,000 cups of spinach or do you want to eat one piece of pizza? Like, to me, there's a little bit of a trade-off there. And again, it's this idea that like one slice of pizza is not going to do anything to you health-wise. I mean, probably if you ate only pizza all day for 20 years, then yeah, you might have some issues with artery clogging or what have you. But I think just if you're eating a wide variety of foods, incorporating some of the hyperpalatable foods is going to be an easy way to get in the calories that your body needs. The other thing is, like, it can be very constraining to our lives to sort of be in a place where like, oh, I don't eat food X, or, you know, like I've seen women who make separate meals for themselves and their partners, or themselves and their kids. And, you know, it's a lot of extra time that's spent that's really not necessary. You know, just generally, you know, cooking at home is always, you know, that's always a good thing to do, because then you know what's in the food, you know what the ingredients are. You know, but just sort of thinking about why you are afraid to eat some of the foods that maybe you haven't eaten, like, you know, a bar of chocolate, or a donut. You know, there's, again, like one donut is not going to kill you. A dozen donuts is not going to kill you. So just kind of challenging yourself to eat some of those foods that maybe you feel like are super unhealthy, but in reality, your body is designed to digest them, and they pack a good caloric punch. So they can be really good foods to incorporate to try and help you recover your missing period. And there's no reason not to just eat them when you want to normally, even if you do have your period. I mean, I think, you know, if your life is all about controlling what you eat and exercising a lot and not doing anything quote unquote wrong food wise, you know, you miss out on a lot of stuff, and you miss out on a lot of personal relationships and relationship building times. And, you know, I think one of the really great things about having HA and recovering is learning that you don't have to control your eating and your exercise nearly as much as we are kind of told that we need to by the popular media. So, you know, so many women have expressed to me as they've recovered from HA how much happier they are, and just eating what they feel like eating. And sometimes you eat chips or French fries, and sometimes you eat a salad, and, you know, it's just food. It stops being so much of a focus, and it's just part of your life. Food is fuel, and you just don't think about it anymore. And it's so much easier that way.
Yeah, but I think the problem I see with that is the people who I've worked with who have HA, they do feel terrible when they eat some of these quote junky foods, when they have extra sugar, sometimes because of other health conditions that they have in terms of food intolerances, insulin resistance, gut issues. They can often go alongside. So when they eat maybe some pizza or some donuts, they feel horrendous afterwards. So is it possible to recover your period and overcome HA with just healthy foods if somebody wanted to do that?
I'm not going to say no. But again, you know, I think what I have seen sometimes is that women come to me with all sorts of gut issues and, you know, IBS, what have you. And in some ways, I feel like it's a slippery slope. So if you start with caloric restriction, you're underfueling your body. One of the things it can do is stop producing certain digestive enzymes. So you underfuel, and then you start feeling icky when you eat certain foods. So you stop eating those foods, and that leads to more underfueling. And, you know, you're cutting out more and more and more, because that's sort of the dogma these days is, you know, carbs are bad for you, gluten's bad for you, sugar's bad for you. So people read this, they feel like dairy's bad for you. So they read this, they're like, oh, well, maybe that's my problem. So they cut out more and more and more foods until they have this very constrained, restricted diet. And when they eat any of those things that they're not used to, yeah, they feel poorly. What I find is that if you kind of add back things slowly, for many of these women, the key thing is really eating more, you know, getting enough energy in. And as that happens, they find that they are able to reintroduce some of these foods that have perhaps caused problems in the past, until they get to a point where they can eat everything and they don't have the bloating and the other digestive issues, the constipation. So I think it's a very delicate balancing act during recovery, trying to you know, add back foods. So I think, you know, trying some of the fear foods, trying some of the things that you think make you feel poorly, but really observing your body as you're having them afterwards. You know, I think that can be helpful. My co-author Lisa actually had, a couple times where she had to go to the hospital because of an anaphylactic reaction to beef. And then after working on recovery, she's now able to eat meat with no problem. So, I'm not saying that that's true for everybody. I mean, but it's just, there's so much fear mongering in nutrition information that we get, that I think it leads us down, like I said, it leads us down the slippery slope to restriction and more and more and more restriction, when sometimes the answer is actually the opposite. It's just, it's eating more and, giving our body the fuel that they need. One of the issues with sort of, sticking with the quote unquote healthy eating, is what I've already described, is that it can be incredibly difficult to get in enough calories that way. So I think, if you are able to, then sure, you can do that. But I still would encourage challenging yourself a little bit to step out of your comfort zone, to step out of some of those foods that you're used to eating, and try some of the foods that you maybe think of as not so healthy. Because, again, it's the wider range of things that we allow ourselves to eat. I think the less restrictive our overall mindset. And it just, there's definitely a mind-body connection as well. And sort of releasing some of the fear and stress around, being this perfect picture of health and eating this perfect diet. I just see so many benefits to that in the long term.
Mm-hmm. And I always said that the goal is to get you healthy and get you back into a place of health so that you can go on and do whatever your passion is. My passion is health and nutrition. However, for someone else, I totally understand that that's not what they're into. So my goal is to help them get healthy again so that they can go and excel in their career and start a family and do whatever they love. It shouldn't be their passion too, just because I'm kind of sharing that with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So one more point on that is a lot of women these days are restricting carb intake, particularly simple carbs. And that's something in particular that there is evidence that alone can affect your hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus has glucose and insulin sensors. And so it kind of needs the spikes that you get from some of the simple carbs. So I think that in particular is a place where people should really be, a lot of the information that's out there is based on studies in men. And so I think, sort of recognizing that, a keto diet in particular seems to be really bad for women hormonally. So that's just another thing to consider in terms of, what we've been talking about loosening up some of those restrictions. So certainly I've seen people really thrive when they add back some carbs into their diet if they've been restricting those.
Yeah, the keto diet can help in the short term women regain the cycle if they're suffering with PCOS due to severe insulin resistance. However, I've seen also the more that they carry on with that, and if they don't then shift over to a more carbohydrate containing diet, they obviously may not be able to tolerate massive amounts or the simple carbohydrates that you recommend. But I definitely agree that the keto diet's not the best for women with hormones just in general, whether they've got a hormone imbalance or not. And how do you make sure that someone's eating enough without tracking, or do you often recommend tracking for a couple of days just to make sure you're reaching that good amount and then deleting the apps?
Yeah, exactly that. Okay. So if you already have been tracking, then it's usually pretty easy to know, okay, I could add these things into my daily fare to kind of get up to the 2,500 calorie level. If you haven't been tracking, like doing so for a couple of days, I think can be useful just to see where you're at. And then again, you figure out what things you might need to add. It can be some spoonfuls of nut butter. It can be some nuts. It can be, avocado. I mean, there's so many different ways. Putting more salad dressing on your salad, or adding it if you have been avoiding it. Adding olive oil into pasta sauces, or there's so many different ways to add calories into your day that don't necessarily increase food volume. But yeah, just tracking for a day or two, and then just kind of focusing, like following that general eating pattern, I think usually gets people to a good place.
With the psychological aspects of HA, so when people start to gain weight, that can be a really kind of stressful thing for them. Are there any advice or tips that you recommend to help your mind kind of adapt to that, the new changes, and feel at ease with the whole process? Because it can be quite stressful.
Yeah, I think the number one recommendation is getting rid of your scale, not ever stepping on that thing again, because honestly, like, knowing your weight does nothing positive for you. I mean, you don't need to know that number. And, especially if you're weighing yourself every day through this process, that can be extremely challenging because you've probably gotten used to yourself at a particular size, and seeing the number go up when societally we're told that's a bad thing all the time, that can be really, really difficult. So I think one of my number one tips is just getting rid of the scale altogether. Number two is maybe getting some new clothes. So things that are stretchy and flowy and that don't constrain you particularly. I think it's really hard if you're wearing things like jeans and they start to get tight around your middle. If you're wearing those all day long, it's a constant reminder about the change in your body size. Whereas if you're wearing clothes that are stretchy, that are comfortable and just move with you and your body, then you don't have that same kind of tactile input as to the change in your body size. And so it becomes much easier just not to think about it. Some other things that can help are definitely cleaning up your social media feed and getting rid of some, anybody that makes you feel, you compare and makes you feel unworthy or less than, like, get rid of that stuff. I mean, it's just like, and then look for some body positive accounts, look for a wide variety of bodies and people to follow. I think, seeing a range of people of a range of different sizes and colors and shapes doing all kinds of amazing things, like, that can be so life affirming. One of the people I started following a little while ago is a guy whose Instagram account, I think, is 300 pounds and running. He is this amazing guy. He does marathons. He wears this t-shirt that says slow AF, as in slow. And it's just fabulous. Like, he gets so much joy out of his life, and it's not about his size. It's about all the cool things that he's doing. And, so following people like that who can really help you see that what we've been shown in most of the popular media is not real life. And it's not, for many of us, it's not a happy life to be constantly, focused on the size of our bodies. And, just seeing real people out there doing real things, I think, can be, hugely helpful. Another thing is finding some mantras that speak to you, affirmations. If there are particular times of the day that you feel particularly triggered, having something written down that you can just pull out and look at, like, my body is not an ornament, it's an instrument. I'm so much more than what I look like. The scale doesn't define me, just thinking about all those kinds of things and having them at your fingertips during times of the day when you might feel particularly badly about yourself. Maybe posting something on your mirror if you find, like, looking in the mirror in the morning while you're brushing your teeth, if you find that challenging. So yeah, those are a few ideas.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think it could be a great time for an excuse to go on a shopping spree. Maybe get some yoga leggings, some yoga pants. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're looking to get pregnant, which many women don't realize that they have HA until they do want to get pregnant, because they're on the birth control pill, which masks any kind of change in your period for the most part. So if you do want to get pregnant, you think of them as first trimester clothes, because that can be a time when your normal clothes don't really fit. So having some stretchy, flowy things, it's great.
Yes, exactly. Good idea. And let's talk about the exercise components as well. So you mentioned that it's usually under eating, over exercising, over stressing that can be kind of the vicious cycle that can lead to HA. When it comes to recovery, is exercise off the table? Is it something that you should just stop? Or is there a way that you can incorporate exercise without stressing your body too much?
So I was actually really surprised when I did the survey for my book. I thought that it would be overall amount of exercise that was correlated with period recovery or not. And what I found was actually that it was very strongly correlated with high intensity exercise and really not at all with low intensity exercise. So what I recommend in the book is cutting out high intensity exercise. So that's things like running seems to be one of the worst exercises for HA. I don't really know why. But other, for me, ice hockey, things that are getting your heart rate up to, a high level, I think is what I would classify as high intensity. So what you do, whether you go cold turkey and cut everything out or whether you kind of taper down over time, that really has to be an individual decision, because there's no path that's right for everybody. It really depends on where you are in your life and what your goals are. So I think ultimately you may have to cut out all high intensity exercise. You may not. You may be able to cut down by 50%. So it depends. If you want to get pregnant like today, then probably your best path forward is going to be cutting out all high intensity exercise right now. If you are trying to get your cycles back because you have osteoporosis, probably the same thing. You probably want to cut out your high intensity exercise. If you have normal bone density, you don't want to get pregnant for a couple of years, then you can take a little bit longer. So maybe you can cut down by 50%, relax the intensity a little bit. Don't sort of go for personal records. Do that for a while. See if you get, definitely do the eating more part. I think that's the number one thing. Maybe you get your period back while you're continuing. So it really, it's got to be a sort of conversation with yourself about what your goals are and what's most important to you. Kind of, you can go down a path. Like for some women, try the 50% and they don't get their periods back, and then they try 25% and they don't, and then like, oh, this is just not worth it anymore. Doing a slow jog once a week, I get nothing out of that, so I'm just going to go full turkey. And then they get their periods back a couple of weeks later. So it's really this kind of interplay between your goals, your desires, what works for you. Because the thing is, HA recovery has to work for you, because otherwise you're not going to stick with it. And then, it's like, what's the point? So it has to be, you have to come at it from a place that, of things that you can actually accomplish. That's it. So this is like, for somebody that has an eating disorder, like that can be completely different. And I would definitely defer to medical professionals on that. And, then it's often there's psychological barriers that are in place to make you feel like you need the exercise, you can't eat more. So, that's really a whole different ball game from what I'm talking about, which is somebody who's does not have a bona fide eating disorder. It's just, they think they're being healthy and they've got, some disordered eating maybe. If you're addicted to exercise, if you feel like you must exercise every single day or the world will end, that might be another time where you could consider, okay, maybe I should take a week off and just see what happens. And maybe that week turns into 2 weeks. Because I think a lot of times we don't, we've convinced ourselves that we need to exercise every day, and, kind of learning that no, you don't actually need to. It can feel great to move your body, absolutely, but the world doesn't end if you don't go for a run or if you just sit on the couch for a day. So, I think that's another factor that should probably come into it, is how much you're exercising because you're enjoying the movement versus you feel like you must exercise, and, kind of taking that into account as well.
Yeah, it's an important differentiation. How long, if someone's changed their diet, so they're eating more, they're cutting back on the high intensity exercise, how long will it usually take for the periods to return? I know it's probably completely different for everyone depending on what else is going on, but just as an average, can they expect the period to come back within a couple of weeks, or is it 6 months?
So the median time to recovery from my survey was about 5 months. And the average time was 8 months. So the average is higher than the median. The median is the number that's in the middle, like half the people were quicker, half the people were slower. The average is a bit higher because there were some women who took much longer to recover. And I think that's partly because they didn't find me and this whole idea of the recovery plan for a while, after they were sort of quote unquote trying to recover, but not necessarily going to the place of really actually eating enough for their bodies. So I think that's why the average is a little bit higher. But yeah, I mean, some people do get their, do ovulate and get their first periods within a few weeks, but I would say that's much less common. It's usually a few months, 3 to 6 months, maybe even 3 to 9 months, and certainly can take longer than that. There are other things that one can do, if you've sort of gotten to your body to a place where it's at the size it wants to be, which is often, if you had weight loss in your past, your sort of set point is often where you were prior to that weight loss, when you were sort of eating freely and not really thinking about controlling your body size. So sort of getting back to that sort of body size, eating freely, cutting up high intensity exercise. If you've done that for a while and you've given your body a chance to sort of settle there, then there are other things that we can do to jumpstart your cycles and try and get things going again if it's not happening naturally. But definitely time is an ingredient to this whole equation. So, I do encourage people to wait at least 6 months before sort of trying one of those other options, which I do talk about in the book. But
yeah, would some of those things include herbs or supplements? Do you tend to see that they can help kickstart and bring forward the period?
So there are very few things that I think I would credit with really helping to bring back a period in terms of supplements. So the only one that has any strong evidence around it is acetyl L-carnitine. That's an amino acid that our bodies have naturally. And there have been 3 research studies that have been done where they found that women taking that for 3 to 6 months have menstrual cycles return at a rate of sort of 60 to 70% versus those not taking it where it's much, much lower than that. So that is one supplement that I do often recommend to people. It seems to work better if your luteinizing hormone, your LH, is on the lower side. So if you have a normal LH, probably not worthwhile. The recovery rates in that case is more like 20 to 30%. So that is one thing that I recommend. And I do have a long blog post where I sort of go through the studies, and that's at noperiod.info/ALC. And then the only other thing that I often recommend is flaxseed, ground flaxseed. So you've probably heard of the whole seed cycling thing, take flaxseed and pumpkin seed and then switch to sesame and
Sunflower,
yes. So I actually looked into that, and, I was trying, where is this idea of switching between the seeds coming from? And I could not find origins anywhere. It's just sort of out there on the internet. And so I looked into the medical literature, and it was actually really interesting because in the medical literature, there are no studies where any of those seeds are given to people on an on-again, off-again basis. It's all, let's take sunflower seeds for 3 to 6 months and measure hormonal changes. And honestly, of those 4 seeds, the only one that has strong evidence for being beneficial for hormones is flaxseed. So that's why that's my recommendation now is, no seed cycling, just take flaxseed every day. Certainly the other seeds aren't going to do anything bad. It's totally fine to eat them. But I just think that if you're looking to recover your periods, then flaxseed is the one that I would go with.
I think it's one of those naturopathic practices that doesn't really have any studies, but it's had maybe some positive results in some people, and it's just been passed down. And I've definitely tried it myself. I personally didn't notice much difference, but I've known other people who swear by that it's got the period back, it's helped them get pregnant, so we can't really say that that's not right. But I agree with flax seeds, that's usually the top one that's got the most research, so stick with those, but consume the other seeds as much as you want.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So I want to kind of wrap up things by asking you a few specific questions, maybe about you personally.
Sure.
So the first one would be about your go-to breakfast. So a lot of my clients struggle with breakfast ideas. They're not sure what to eat. If they are avoiding things like cereal and toast for whatever reason, they're not really aware of other breakfast options. So maybe you could share some breakfast ideas and maybe put a HA spin on it. So if a woman has hypothalamic amenorrhea, what's a really good breakfast that she could go for to help boost her hormones?
So my favorite breakfast is I actually make my own yogurt. And so I have a big bowl of that that I put honey into, and then I put chia seeds and flax seeds and hemp on the top. So I put like a layer of honey and then a layer of those seeds, and then I eat the seeds off, and then I put another layer of honey and more of the same seeds and eat that off. So I don't let it mix in. It kind of like gets all gummy and gross. So that is definitely my go-to breakfast. On days when I don't, like I haven't made the yogurt or whatever, I'll often have toast with sunflower butter, and a nice glass of whole milk. So I'm kind of on the dairy train. I know that doesn't work for everybody.
Yep.
But certainly for me, I feel perfectly fine when I have dairy. So those are sort of my two go-to breakfasts. I know a lot of women like to do overnight oats, just because that's something that you can prepare the night before and have as a quick breakfast. And that's something that you can throw the flaxseed into, a lot of fruits. I'm not a big fruit and vegetable eater. It's actually kind of anti-vegetarian. And it stems from some experiences in my early childhood. And, I often joke that my gateway vegetable was pizza when I was in high school. Until I had pizza, I did not eat any fruits or vegetables whatsoever. So now I'm much more varied in terms of my vegetables. I still don't like the texture of fruit, so I'll have it in smoothies and stuff like that. But certainly you can add fruit into your yogurt if that's something that you enjoy, and probably is healthier than what I do. But hey, we all have our things, right?
There is some kind of scientific research behind people's aversion to vegetables. There's people who have like the hyper responder or hyper taster gene, where they, especially cruciferous vegetables, they're just repulsed by them. So that may be going on.
Yeah.
That may be your kind of issue. The second question is going to be if there was one herb, nutrient, or supplement that you personally can't live without. So if you were stranded on a desert island, if there was one product or food that you just need to have with you, what would that be?
I really can't say that there would be one thing that I would be unable to live without. I mean, I think that we can get our nutrients and needs met in so many different ways that to say that there's one thing that's going to like be this perfect balancing magic pill, I don't really buy that.
Okay.
So, certainly in terms of HA recovery, none of those supplements I've ever seen working in somebody who's not making the lifestyle changes to go along with it. Yeah. So, I don't buy the idea that there's like a magic pill for anything. Yeah.
Yep. And third question would be, what's your biggest piece of advice for someone currently struggling with HA?
I think my biggest piece of advice would be to try and work on the mental aspect along with making the lifestyle changes. So some of the things that we talked about before, like learning about, people who are doing amazing things and, no matter what their body size, and learning that you are so much more than what you look like, and your value to the world does not come from the size of your body. It doesn't come from, how many lines or wrinkles you have on your face. It doesn't come from the color of your hair. It comes from who you are and what you do and who you love and who loves you, and, the relationships and the other things that you can do, I think are so much more important. And sort of, it's very hard in this day and age to appreciate that and accept that for yourself. Sometimes it's very easy to do for other people, and to, not focus on what other people look like necessarily, but more on what they do and their relationship with you. But we tend to be so much more critical of ourselves. So I think giving some of the grace that we give to other people to ourselves as well can be one of the best parts about this journey, and one of the things that I think is most important to learn.
And final question is, where can everyone find you online? So maybe share where you can get your book, your Facebook group, and maybe social media if you're on that too.
Absolutely. So My website is www.noperiodnowwhat.com. So I have a blog on there where I have tons of information about different supplements and various other additional research that I've done since publishing my book. You can obviously get my book from there. I do appreciate it if you order from there rather than Amazon, because Amazon doesn't pay as well. So it's just a nice way to support me or any other author. You can, I do have a section where you can sign up to work with me directly. I do work with people one-on-one, so that's all on the website. The Facebook support group, there are quite a few of them, but a good place to start is just at noperiod.info/support. That's sort of the current general group. I've started a new one about once a year, just because I feel like when they get too big, it gets a little overwhelming and people kind of get lost. So I like to keep it a little bit smaller and more intimate. And then on social media, I'm at No Period Now What on Instagram and Twitter, but much more active on Instagram. So that's probably a good place to find me.
Great. And I'll again include all of those links in the show notes for everyone wondering. And I just want to thank you so much, Nicola, for your time. This has been a great podcast. You've shared so much valuable information. And yeah, just thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I always appreciate the opportunity to share with more people. It's great.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Hormones in Harmony podcast. If you like this episode, please leave me a rating and review, as this helps to spread the word to other women dealing with hormone imbalances. As a massive thank you gift, I'll send you a free guide, 6 Steps to Hormonal Harmony. All you need to do is screenshot your rating and review, then email it to me at hormonesinharmony@gmail.com, and I'll send you the link to download this free guide. If you haven't already, check out my website vivanaturalhealth.co.uk and Instagram page at Viva Natural Health for tons more free content and inspiration. You can also schedule a free 30-minute hormone troubleshooting call to find out the next step to take in order to overcome your symptoms naturally. See you back here next week for another episode.